Be sure to tune into JG8 and JG7 to learn more about the history of college football and the history of Major League Baseball. New videos drop a minimum of 2 times per week on each channel. Click the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. I want you to picture this absolutely insane hypothetical scenario. You're a Jaguars fan, and they're playing the Baltimore Ravens down in Jacksonville. The game goes horribly wrong for your Jaguars, as they wind up losing and playing pretty poorly in the process. It felt like a game that you absolutely had to have to keep your season alive, and you couldn't win it. Naturally, you're pretty upset about the loss, and about spending your hard-earned money and watching your team completely lay an egg, wasting your Sunday in the process. You go back to your car, you're waiting to get out of the parking lot, and all of a sudden, a man comes up to you and approaches the vehicle. Understandably, you're confused, especially because this person is all decked out in Ravens gear, and you have no idea at first glance who they are. But then, upon second glance, you realize that the person approaching your car is none other than Ravens head coach John Harbaugh, who desperately asks if you can give him a ride to the airport, because he missed the team bus and has no way of getting back to Baltimore on time with the team. I mean, something like that seems absurd, right? There's no possible way that this could happen, where a fan has to drive the opposing coach to the airport because the bus somehow left without the coach. Well, the man that you've been watching this entire time is Denver Broncos head coach Red Miller. For the most part, his first season with the Broncos was a massive success. You couldn't draw it up any better if you tried. Here was a man who, in his first season in Denver, took over a team that had never even made the playoffs before, and he somehow guided them to the Super Bowl, as they made it all the way to Super Bowl 12, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Here was a man who had never been anything more than an offensive line coach, and somehow, in the span of a year, became one of the hottest coaching names on the planet, and was coaching one of the best teams in football. Here was a man who was seemingly on top of the world, and couldn't do anything wrong whatsoever. That is, everything except for this incident right here. Because in Week 6 of the 1977 season, Red Miller, the head coach of the Broncos, somehow missed the Broncos' own team bus back from the game. And the story of how he eventually made up for lost time and for the delay is absolutely crazy, to the point where it might never happen again. Because this is the story behind what has to be, in the over 60-year history of the Denver Broncos, the strangest and wackiest postgame in franchise history. Before I talk about the actual postgame in question, and what was so crazy about it, we need some context to understand, well, what happened during the actual game, and how the Broncos were doing. It's October 23rd, 1977. It's Week 6 of the NFL season, and as we're nearing the halfway point of what would be the final 14-game season in NFL history, we have a big game in the AFC on our hands between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Denver Broncos over at Riverfront Stadium. This was a really big game for the Broncos in what was looking, quite easily, like their best season of all time on paper. On one hand, the Broncos entered this game against the Bengals with a perfect 5-0 record, being one of just 3 teams left in the league, alongside the Baltimore Colts and the Dallas Cowboys, to be without any blemishes after 5 weeks. They had a great offense that was 4th in the league in points scored, had the dominant Orange Crush defense that had allowed just 33 points, which was the best total in the AFC, and came out to an average of just 6.6 points per game. And they had the best point differential in all football at plus 77. That was the good news. On the other hand, they didn't have a ton of room for error, not just if they wanted to get a hold of that number 1 seed, but if they wanted to make the playoffs, period. If they lost this game, then they risked the possibility of not just being in a tie for the division lead with the Oakland Raiders, who sat at 4-1, but they also risked the possibility of being tied with the 4-1 Miami Dolphins for the lone wildcard spot in the conference. Remember, only 4 teams in each conference made the playoffs back then, so Denver could go from the number 1 seed to the outside looking in just like that. Denver was obviously off to a great start. I mean, they were 5-0 for crying out loud, but they had to keep up the pressure against a disappointing, below 500 Bengals team. And sure enough, that's exactly what they did, as when all was said and done, the Broncos emerged victorious, quieted the 54,395 fans that packed Riverfront Stadium on this sunny, 59-degree autumn day, and won it by a final score of 24-13. After falling behind 7-0 in the first quarter, Denver scored 24 of the game's final 30 points, and held onto the ball, not turning it over once, while also not allowing any sacks. Meanwhile, on the other side, Bengals quarterback Ken Anderson, widely regarded as one of the best quarterbacks in all of football, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, did absolutely nothing. He went 9 for 17 with 67 yards passing, no touchdowns, 1 interception, and a passer rating of 38.1, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Once again, the Orange Crush defense came to play, as Cincinnati could not move the ball whatsoever. All in all, even though Craig Morton got hurt in the third quarter, it was smooth sailing for the Broncos, as they won their 6th straight game to start the season off, keeping what felt like an absolutely magical run alive, and keeping their undefeated first-place record intact. After the game, Miller met with the press, and was all smiles about the hard-earned win against one of the more formidable opponents in the AFC throughout the 1970s. Said Miller, "The mark of a good team is when reserves have to come in and play well. The bench strength has to be there." Side note, I love how the writer of the article said that this was a come-from-behind win, because the Broncos were down 7-0 in the first quarter. Not really sure I'd classify that as a comeback, but I digress. He then added with a smile, 6-0 isn't too bad, and I don't think anyone can disagree with him on that. But what happens usually after the post-game press conference? Well, once that happens, if you're the road team, you load up the bus and wait for the players to finish meeting with the press, and then it's off to catch your flight back home, which in this case was the roughly 3-hour flight from Cincinnati back to Denver. Except Miller decided to take a bit of a detour, in what would be the first and only time in NFL history that a head coach was involved in a controversy after a game against the Bengals with regards to traveling back home with his team. Now, unlike what happened with Urban Meyer in 2021, Miller fully intended to travel back with the Broncos. That was always the plan. However, when he walked outside of the stadium, he saw a few fans waiting for him and lined up, asking for autographs. And Miller, being the charitable guy that he was, and the guy that seemingly no one had a bad thing to say about, decided to oblige, and decided to sign autographs outside of the stadium. And when I say he signed autographs, I don't mean just 1 or 2. I mean he signed a lot of autographs, to the point where the team buses had to leave to catch their flight in time. Now you would think that the team bus wouldn't leave without Miller, right? You would think it would be pretty easy to tell if the head coach was on the bus or not, and that of all the people on the team and on the staff, that the head coach would be the most identifiable. Well, here's the problem. Football teams are big. They have a lot of players and coaches on the roster, which means that one bus isn't enough. There were 2 buses that loaded up the Broncos and took them back to the airport to take the charter jet back home. And this meant that even though one bus driver knew that Miller wasn't on his bus, he didn't think it was a problem, since it just meant that Miller was on the other bus. And obviously, you can't be on 2 buses at the same time. The problem with that logic? The other bus driver thought the same thing. And this meant that when both buses left Riverfront Stadium to head to the airport, both bus drivers thought that Miller was on the other bus, when in reality, he was not. He was still at the stadium signing autographs. Finally, after Miller got through all of the autograph signings, he realized he had a major problem on his hands, more stressful than anything that happened during the game, or anything that had happened throughout this successful season. The bus was gone. That's right, both team buses left without him. Now, all of a sudden, Miller had to find a way to get to Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport in a city he was unfamiliar with, all by himself. Which meant that Miller was on the side of the road at Riverfront Stadium with his thumb up, trying to hitchhike his way to the airport. Again, this is an NFL head coach that we're talking about having to rely on random people who were probably upset and not in the best of moods after beating their team to act out of the kindness of their heart and trust a man enough to bring him in their car and take them to the airport across state lines. Everything about this seems absurd. Finally, after waiting and waiting for any offer, with time running out before the jet was going to leave without him, since nobody knew his whereabouts, he got 2 Cincinnati fans to stop for him, and got the Cincinnati fans to take him to the airport. The names of the 2 people who picked up Miller were never identified. However, for their generosity, Miller promised both of these fans Bronco tickets if they ever came out to Denver. And with the promise of free tickets, just like that, Miller had a ride to the airport, courtesy of 2 Bengals fans who, whether it was on TV or inside the stadium, just witnessed Miller and the Broncos beat their team. And right as the jet was on the runway waiting to take off, Miller boarded the plane. This is one of those times where I can actually say the whole plane clapped. And it's not a that happened moment. Literally the whole plane clapped, but jabbed him along the way, with players yelling, "Come on back here and pay up." The players voted to fine their coach $100, which in today's money comes out to about a $488 fine, making this, in all likelihood, at the time, the most expensive autograph in the history of the Denver Broncos franchise. For what it's worth, Miller said that he would pay the fine, and had no trouble doing so for his mistake. If he was going to punish his players when they screwed up, it was only fair for him to be punished when he screwed up. However, even though Miller's wallet was about $100 lighter, the crisis was averted. Miller was able to board the plane and make it back to Denver with the team on time so they could regroup and get ready for their next game, which was a big AFC West battle against the Oakland Raiders for the second time in 3 weeks. One writer down in Miami, by the name of John Crittenden, summed up the whole situation best by saying, "Can you imagine the Dolphin bus leaving without Don Shula, no matter how late he was?" And yeah, when you put it like that, it truly puts into perspective just how absurd this whole situation was. So just to recap all the weirdness and wackiness that happened here, because it's a lot. Red Miller coaches his butt off and helps the Broncos win their 6th straight game of the season by going on the road to Cincinnati to defeat the Bengals. Then, after giving his post-game press conference, he stays after to sign some autographs for kids and for fans waiting for his arrival. Losing track of the time and the bus schedule, he forgets to stop signing autographs to board the bus, and neither bus driver realizes that Red Miller is missing and is not there, because both bus drivers just assume that he's on the other bus. Miller then realizes that the team bus left without him, and he has to hitchhike his way to the airport in the car of 2 Bengals fans, where not even an hour before, he was public enemy number 1. If that's not the strangest postgame ever in the history of the Broncos, then quite frankly, I don't know what is. Inside Riverfront Stadium, the Broncos were great. Outside of the stadium in the parking lot, not so much. Because to start off the 1977 season, the only thing that could stop Red Miller and his great momentum to kick off the season wasn't an opposing offense or an opposing defense, but rather his inability to tell the time. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com And be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.